Hey guys, how are you all doing today? My name is Jordan McCracken-Foster, and I'm a teaching artist here at Art Prof, and I'm here today with Prof Lieu. And what we're going to be discussing today is what makes a 2D composition great. So if you guys want to turn your artistic weakness into your strength, definitely check out our website at artprof.org, where we have lots of great resources, free tutorials, critiques, art dares, pro development, and all that good stuff. So, Clara, why don't you get us started into the discussion?
Well, this is a big question. What is it that makes a 2D composition great? And it's a hard question to answer because you can't say, oh, just check off A, B, and C. You're all set. It's going to be great. But I think what people don't realize is that good 2D compositions don't have to be complicated. They don't have to have 500 figures in them. They don't have to be 10 feet tall and be about epic wars. They can actually be something quite different. In fact, if you guys didn't know, this is a recent Rolling Stone cover by Kadir Nelson, which actually is a contemporary play off of Delacroix's piece. So it's interesting how some compositions almost repeat throughout history. So there is this misconception that, oh, they have to be so dramatic and such a big deal. But you also have images like, for example, this one. So how would you describe this composition, Jordan, and why is this one effective?
I would first off say that this is just simple. I think the best compositions can have a lot of things in it, but overall, it's the simplicity of it that helps us read it. It's the clarity of everything. So when I'm seeing this piece, I'm seeing an older gentleman just sitting in his chair, maybe thinking about, his life, the things he's done, the current circumstances that he's in. Anything, any of those things can be it. But the point is, it's simple enough for me to grasp and put my own thoughts and feelings into.
Half this composition feels almost blank. And that's so different than those epic compositions we saw earlier. And even this one, it's a room that's empty with a coat hanging on the wall. It seems so mundane, but if that's what you're trying to talk about as an artist, it can be beautiful. Now, same thing with this composition. Over half of it is flat black. And yet, do you feel, Jordan, that this is a successful composition?
Yeah, definitely. It's one of those things that it still feels very clear to me. I think that it gives the feeling of depth by having that gradient in the ground, like starting from light and then going darker. There's this feeling of emptiness, of maybe hopelessness, and I feel like it puts me into the mind of the characters that are in this piece.
And that black void, it feels really, really vast, which makes sense because it does have this haunting feeling to it. This is the same illustrator, Dadu Shin, who has done a lot of editorial illustrations for the New York Times. And their work is very varied, but it does tend to be on the simpler side. It does tend to deal with graphic shapes. It doesn't have all the rendering that you might see in Jericho. So what we're trying to tell you guys, it's not that there's a formula or certain, quote, rules you have to follow. It really is case by case. Do you think that's true, Jordan?
Oh yeah, there's definitely some key principles, but almost every rule in art can be broken. For example, there's often the rule of don't have a completely centered composition, but there are times where that can be made interesting. I've seen it happen before. It's not done often, but it depends on the type of piece you're trying to create, the story that you're trying to tell, the characters that are in it. All of those things matter.
Morning Atlas is asking, what exactly is composition and why is it important? Great question. The simplest definition I could give you is composition is where things are located on the page. For example, this illustration by Dadu Shin, you see you have these colored figures. They are located in the middle. Now, Dadu Shin in another version could say, you know what? I don't want to put them in the middle. I'm going to put both of them to the right-hand side. And maybe in another piece, they say, you know what? I just want to have one figure. I don't want to have two. It's those fundamental decisions about placement. And that's why they're important, because where you put the people really does change the way you look at the composition. We'll give you guys some examples of this. So let's talk about varying sizes of shapes. Why do you think this might matter, Jordan?
Having a variety of shapes is just more interesting. If I have 3 objects that are the exact same size, it's not going to be that exciting. It's not going to draw you into the piece. But when you suddenly have one big, one medium, one small, then it gives you some variety to look at. And it could be anything. It could be an object, it could be a group of people, it could be stripes on a shirt, whatever the case is. It always makes things more interesting to have a variety.
This is Faith Ringgold. If you guys have never heard of her work, definitely check it out. These are all quilts. They're incredible. They're rich and they're full, but she's somebody who I think really understands shape. Now, how about this one, Jordan? This is from Moana. And how is shape being used here?
So we have this large shape, this monstrous lava character. I forget the name. I think it's like to something. Someone in the comments knows. I forget the name. But it's this very imposing figure, and we're supposed to feel intimidated by it. It's been threatening Moana throughout the entire movie, and now they're coming face to face. And you got little Moana over here, who's probably like 5'3", and is confronting this monster. But their contrast in shape is part of what makes this so interesting, as well as the fact that Moana is what's behind her is the ocean, is something calming. It's pretty, it's soothing. So it says a lot just by having those key shapes there.
And it's important because the big shape makes Moana look so much smaller. You could have a picture where it's just Moana and you don't have the lava character, and she would not seem so small. So a lot of this is relative. You make something feel smaller by adding something that's really gigantic. So another still from Moana, and this one's a little bit more sophisticated, but it's the same idea. So Jordan, how would you break down this scene?
Sure. So in this scene, if I'm not mistaken, it's the end of the movie. She's trailing off into a new adventure, and she's leading her people on these boats. And what's really interesting is just by having her much closer and much bigger, it puts her as the key focal point. And all the boats behind her, because they have very similar silhouettes and they're all the same style, we kind of group them all together as a single entity. We see them as united. And so that can be a technique that you guys can use whenever you're trying to have a large group, but you want to make them still feel a little different, but have some connective tissue. So that's pretty much what's going on here.
I guess the name is Tafiti?
Ah, yes.
Now we have to.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, that one person, AJ.
And by the way, if you guys want to hear more about shape, we do have this stream that's entirely focused on shape. This is a really important one. And this, I think, is critical because a lot of times people think composition is just about making something that's visually engaging. It's a feast for the eyes and, oh, look at these things. And I'm so enthralled by it. But composition is more than that. It's not just does it look exciting, but does it serve the subject of the artwork and the mood? Like we've got the Prince of Egypt here. Tell us in the chat if you guys saw this movie. Jordan, I'm not sure I saw the whole thing.
Oh, Clara. Oh boy.
I'm sorry. So what is the atmosphere of this scene, Jordan?
Sure. So this is the very opening of the movie. And it's, for those who've never seen The Prince of Egypt, it's the story of Moses. And in the story of Moses, it starts with Hebrews being in Egyptian bondage. And so they start off the movie with having all these Hebrew slaves building all the monuments of this pharaoh. And what the shot here shows is how gigantic this giant head is, the monument to Pharaoh is compared to all the slaves that are working on it. And so the distance we see in the atmosphere, we feel the heat of the day, we see all these people and how tired they are, and it has a really big presence. And the song's quite good.
It feels oppressive. It feels like a space where you almost can't breathe, which I think totally makes sense with the story. Now, The Lion King, on the other hand, very different narrative. So how would you explain this narrative, Jordan?
Sure. So this is also the very opening of The Lion King. And unlike the oppressive opening in Prince of Egypt, this one is supposed to be a triumph. So little Simba is born. He's being presented to the lands, the Pride lands, and it's, you have the sun shining and everything is pointed directly to Simba. Even the little rock that they're standing on is kind of guiding your eye to that small little focal point. And if I remember correctly, we even zoom out, so we might have started on small Simba and seen then enlarge the frame, but everything's just showing you this is what's important.
Maya is saying it's kind of a rule of thirds thing with the ocean versus the sky. We're talking about the Moana still. We actually did not include the rule of thirds. I'll tell you, Jordan, I don't really use that. Do you use the rule of thirds? And what is it?
Okay, so the rule of thirds is when you split the composition horizontally and vertically into thirds. And there's supposed to be 4 intersection points that and the idea is that if you create a composition, put the focal point in one of those 4 locations, it will be a good composition. I think it's one of those things that's good to keep in mind and it's good to start with, but I don't necessarily say every composition has to have that. But it is much easier to have something that is engaging or, so yeah.
Now we've got Raiders of the Lost Ark, and we were just talking about how perfect the color scheme is. The fact that the people that are digging are down below. Indiana Jones is very tall and he's above everybody else. It serves the narrative, which is them trying to go down and find the Ark so their faces can melt at the end of the movie, right?
Not them, not those guys. They're the good guys.
Now, I have not seen this movie. But Jordan, why don't you explain these 2 scenes and what they have to do with each other? Because this first scene, it's actually the same boat that you see here. And yet they're very different compositions. So what's going on?
So for those who don't know, The Life of Pi is about a story of a boy who gets trapped in the ocean on a boat with a tiger. And by this point of the movie, if I remember correctly, the tiger is on the boat and he builds Pi, the name of the character, he builds a little raft for himself because there's a freaking tiger on the boat. So, and you would think by that premise, by them being out at sea for the whole movie, that they wouldn't come up with a lot of interesting ways to show this visually. But what they do is they add these story elements of these bioluminescent creatures, or they'll have the water perfectly calm so it reflects the sky, and almost these situations that aren't natural, but they feel like we can connect with them. And it adds so much beauty to the narrative of the story and this sense of awe and wonder and fantasy that the story is going for.
And you can see this feels fairly ominous in terms of the location of things, but then you add the clouds and it's a completely different feeling. So composition really should line up with the narrative and what you're trying to say. It shouldn't just be, oh, that looks cool. It should say, well, maybe this is being placed there to facilitate the story better. Now, this is Paula Rego, who I really think is so underappreciated. She's like Balthus, but way better, in my opinion. But her work is strange and awkward and surreal, and people have weird body proportions. Sometimes they're wearing rabbit heads. Like, you cannot explain anything in a Paula Rego image. But look at how the compositions are like that. I mean, doesn't this composition look like it's about to collapse?
It feels very chaotic, but it's like organized chaos in a way. So like everything feels like it's in its right spot, but I can't quite put my finger on like what exactly is going on. It feels more like a movie poster, actually, in a way.
She messes with you because if you guys look in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a tiny little person at the bottom. You don't even notice that until you've looked at it for a little while. And so she definitely keeps you guessing. Now, a good composition, I think, should engage you from far away and up close. And what I mean by that, Jordan, have you ever gone into an art gallery and seen something from across the gallery and thought, oh, that looks really cool. I'm going to go up and I'm going to look at it up close. And then I get up there, I'm like, it's not that great. Up close. Has that ever happened to you?
That happens only when I get close enough to see the technique that is used. Usually, if I'm drawn by the thumbnail or the seeing it from far away, I do still go to see it.
So this is Shazia Sikandar, who actually is having her first New York City show in, I think, 9 years. But she's a Pakistani artist who actually revolutionized the use of miniature painting, although she's done all kinds of things now. And I love her work because it definitely has an impact, like this huge flame, this explosion that's going through. But the thing is, when you get up close, you're like, oh my God, there's so much in here that I didn't know was there before. And so it's this idea that you can have a big, impactful shape and moment, but that when you get down into the details, there's so much more to look at, because you can see the architecture of the stairs, but like you see that little pattern in the background, like it's so delicate and beautiful. I mean, I could sit in a room with her work for hours and hours. Okay, what do we mean by this, Jordan?
Moves your eye around the entire artwork. So when you have a canvas to work with, let's say it's 11 by 17 or something, that's a lot of space to fill up. And you don't want to make a composition that's not going to utilize as much space as possible. You want to be able to find a way to guide the viewer through a series of steps. So you can say, oh, this is the first read, the second read, the third read, and however many you want. But it's really important in a composition overall.
Well, I think it's making use of all the space so that parts of the painting don't feel totally neglected. And this one, I think it's very blatant, lettuce to squash to garlic or whatever. But I think the concept that one thing leads you to another, that's a really great way to engage. And Cotan, who is this Spanish still life painter, he does it in really clever ways. Like, how cool is this little like swirl at the bottom? Like, that was not an accident, right?
No, it had to be done beforehand. And that's another key thing, is making sure you think of this stuff before you get too far into the piece. You don't want to spend 30 hours on it and then be like, oh shoot, I need to move that 3 inches to the left. Like that you don't want that to be your scenario.
Okay, so let's talk about balance. And I know people were saying in the chat, it's about balance. Sometimes it's about being off balance. But I do think contrasting loud areas that maybe have very dramatic energy, like these marks by Joan Mitchell. But then if you look at the bottom of the painting, it's actually very quiet. There's not a lot of activity going on in there. So why is this balance and contrast helpful, Jordan?
It's similar to how we mentioned shapes earlier, big, medium, and small. It's about having variety. And the cool thing about having that sort of contrast in loud versus quiet, you can do it in a variety of ways. The way we just saw with Joan Mitchell, it's through line work. You can have it through color. You can have it through lighting. And there's a huge, open, vast door for you to be able to figure all this stuff out. You just have to figure out what works best for the type of piece you're going for.
This is Frederick Mershimer, who is a mezzotint artist. And if you guys know what mezzotint is, your head's going to explode when you look at this stuff, because this is scraped out of a copper plate. So the parts you scrape are the white. It's insane to me that these are mezzotints. But you look at these and they are very busy because he is so precise about the architecture and the details. But if you guys look at this print, do you see the lower right-hand corner? It's just ground and there's nothing happening there. And you need that. It's like the little oasis. You need some time to just chill out, right? You can't have every minute be so full of activity. Okay. How about depth and space, Jordan? How does this play into composition?
Most times people will want to create a composition that shows a landscape or some type of space where you see a long distance. And that's huge for your composition. So in this case, with my favorite movie, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, we see Spider-Man kind of in the middle ground. The closest thing to us is actually the buildings on the side, and we see the everything going further back into space and the sky behind him. But the other thing about the composition that makes this cool is how it's flipped, because typically we will see him falling down. But with this film, what they try to do is they want him to kind of rise up into his role with this scene. And so they flip the composition by making him going towards the buildings like that. It's like he's flying. So Yeah, I love that. I had to throw that tidbit in there.
Of course you did. And if you guys want to break it down more concretely, one thing to think about is basically the foreground, which is the stuff that's closest to you as the viewer, the middle ground, which is a little further away, and then the background, which is way back into the distance. Now, foreground, middle ground, and background, it could be miles and miles and miles away, or it could be a very condensed space. I could look at my desk, which is 2 feet long, and say, oh, here's the foreground, middle ground, and background. So this applies to everything. It doesn't matter how big that physical space is. It's always there, no matter what you're doing. Scott has a comment. I feel that something I learned above all else in my first year was to edit so that you use details sparingly. If not, then nothing looks detailed because everything does. What do you think about that, Jordan?
I totally agree. It's not going to stand out if everything's the exact same. If everything is super detailed, then nothing stands out anymore. It's like if you have an album, let's say a 10-song album, and 9 of those songs are very fast-paced and heavy and lots of syncopation, all that, and you have a single ballad, that single ballad is going to stand out because it's different. And that's that detail that we're talking about. So you definitely want to have variety when you're creating your work like that.
Well, I also think it comes down to not making a composition that's too predictable, that everything's done the same way. And so you feel that once you've seen one section, you've seen all of it. So it's creating some type of surprise, something that your viewer maybe isn't expecting. Point of view, really powerful storytelling tool here. So what's going on here, Jordan, in terms of point of view?
Okay, so this is again from Spider-Verse, and this scene is towards the middle of the movie where they're in Peter Parker's basement, and he has all of his Spider-Man suits behind the glass window, and Miles is looking up at the Spider-Man suit, and what it's symbolizing is though he has these abilities, same abilities as Peter Parker, he's not ready to take on the mantle just yet. He still has some growth to do. But in the next image, this is later on in the movie where he's finally starting to take on that role, and they symbolize that by having his face shown directly over the mask and having it fit perfectly. And they don't have any words. They never go like, hey, your face is, lined up to his face. Maybe it means you're ready. They don't do stuff like that. It's done very subtly, but when you catch it, it just makes it so much more brilliant. And so I love just seeing those two, I don't want to say contrast each other because they're very similar shots, but see how they play off each other.
Well, this goes back to our original definition of what is composition. Composition is placement, where you choose to put something. Now, in this case, where they chose to put Miles's face on Spider-Man tells the story. And in this case, the placement is huge. It tells one story in one scene, and it tells another story in another one. And so don't ever take composition for granted, you guys. I think oftentimes composition feels like an invisible skill. Does that make any sense? I just feel like it's something people don't think about, but it's so fundamental to building an artwork.
Yeah, it's hard to grasp when you're first thinking about it. And the way it worked for me is I actually started studying film, and I really started analyzing like really good shows and really good directors that are like critically acclaimed. And I made the decision, especially in live action animation shows, like you don't waste shots. Everything has to have a purpose. And so I would look and be like, why would they have me on this frame for 5 seconds? Like, what's the point of that? And I would start analyzing this stuff in my head. And that's how I started coming up with a lot of these, ideas for different shots.
Well, that brings up another point, which is that I have a lot of people who say to me, well, listen, I want to get better at composition. And it's hard because there's not a clear path for how to do that. I can't just say, oh, well, Jordan, you just got to log more time drawing the model. That's very straightforward. I think it's part of what you said is just looking at other people's compositions, trying to break them down and figure out, okay, what is it about this composition that I really like? But I also think just as an artist to try lots of different compositions, try some that are super busy, try some that are quiet, try some that are scatterbrained. What helped you get better at composition?
I think a lot of it was just thinking about things psychologically. For example, what is it that if let's say I'm doing a scene that's supposed to be intimidating, what makes me feel intimidated? Things that are bigger than me, things that are dark, like like the woods, or a dark alley or something like that. Things that are sharp. And so when I started analyzing things on a very basic level, then it started giving me a lot more leg room to figure out how to put that in my work. And I think if everyone started thinking of things like that on a very simple level, then everything will just start flowing a lot better. I think we overcomplicate things sometimes.
For sure. And part of it is just being conscious of composition. Because I talk to students and I say, well, your composition is not working very well. And they say to me, well, that didn't even occur to me. I didn't even think about it. So just knowing is half the battle, right? Okay. Let's talk about point of view in terms of eye level. This tends to be the typical point of view that your average person will just do as a default. It's pretty plain, pretty ordinary. But then what happens here, Jordan?
So this is part of the psychological thing I was talking about. So if I'm intimidated by something, it's probably bigger than me. But if someone is probably feeling discouraged or let down, we might look down on them. And that's what we're getting here. This is Mr. Incredible. He's in his cubicle. He's super cramped. Everything is square and boring. And we're just looking down on him. And his life just sucks. Like everything about this is cold and dreary. And you don't want to be, it's very clear that he doesn't want to be there. And this shot, while it's kind of sad, is completely intentional, and it makes so much sense for the story that they're doing. And they even added the detail of the giant cylinder in his cubicle. He's the biggest guy in there, and he's even more cramped than he ought to be. And it even says danger, like he could possibly die. It's wild, but it's so perfect. It makes so much sense for the shot.
Well, I also feel like a point of this is to show that really bland, monotonous field of cubicles. And if we were looking at the scene at eye level, we wouldn't see that. From a bird's eye view, from way up above, you can say, oh my gosh, everybody has a cubicle. They're all the same. They're all boring and bland. And that is serving the story. Now, point of view is not always necessarily so dramatic. Sometimes it makes a difference where you are in relation to Frozone. Like here, I'm behind Frozone if I'm in the scene. So why is that different, Jordan, than say if I was facing him?
Well, so the point of the scene is he's, getting ready to suit up. He's getting ready to become Frozone. He's changing from Lucius to Frozone in this moment. And by us seeing what he's looking at, it emphasizes that a lot more. And it's now, if it were a secret, like we didn't know what his suit looked like and it was showtime, then it could be really cool to have that reveal later on. But we don't need that. We know who he is. We know what he looks like. So this helps us plant our feet or plant our shoes in the same spot that he is.
Then we have worm's eye view, which is basically if you were a little worm on the ground and you're about to be mowed down by Elastigirl. So what does worm's eye view usually do for the scene, Jordan?
It can make something feel intimidating or powerful. We think, like when we're little kids, right? We look up to our parents; they're huge, and we as little kids are like, parents, mom, dad, they can solve everything, or grandparent, or uncle, or auntie, or whatever, big brother. And so that this feeling right here makes Elastigirl feel more powerful. Beyond that, she's on a really cool motorcycle. She's got her super suit on, and she's got a ferocious look on her face. So when you combine all those elements on top of, whoa, look at that, she's above me, she's got this power, it just enhances the scene a lot.
Morning Atlas is asking, do you always think about composition? Like, for example, looking at the thumbnail live stream, which is what Kat and I did yesterday, one of your compositions were aimed at the middle of the page. When you were making that, were you thinking of composition? It depends. Sometimes I think more deliberately. Other times, if I'm just getting started, just sketching out different ideas, I don't think about it that much. When I tend to think about it is, let's say I've done a thumbnail and I've done a whole bunch of them. Then I go back and I revise and I make adjustments. that's when I'm really thinking intentionally, where I'm going, oh, I don't really like that crop, or I want to move this down. But sometimes there is a logic to just drawing whatever and seeing what happens. I don't know. When do you think about composition, Jordan?
It's kind of similar. The first thing for me, especially in what I do, is just figure out the story. And for example, Edna and Jack Jack, right? There's your story. And then what I do is I try and put all these combinations of shots together that will be like, okay, what am I trying to say with this scene? Am I supposed to make someone intimidating or frightened, or are they far apart? Are they close together? And I figure it out based on that. But it usually comes after I figure out what it is I'm trying to say and the emotion I'm going for.
This is an interesting comment from Birdsong. They're saying art schools said they couldn't teach composition, so I learned it from books. I mean, do you think, Jordan, you can teach somebody composition or not?
I think you can teach. I think you can teach composition, or at least some guiding principles. Composition is one of those things, though, that doesn't have a right answer all the time, because every story, every painting is different, and if they are the exact same, then we call that plagiarism. So I think that it's definitely easy or possible to learn from books, from YouTube videos, from live streams, and other things like that.
I like this as a follow-up to that comment from Angie, who says some educators are hyper-focused on math things like the golden section and measurement systems. That always confuse me because I have a learning disability. I think it just has to be a fairly loose process, because I'm the same way. I'm not good with measuring and golden mean and all those things. That confuses me. On the other hand, I don't believe that you can say, oh, I can't teach you. You're just gonna I don't believe in that. I think there are things you can mention, like what we're bringing up. And we are going to be doing a stream fairly soon where we do give you more concrete actions for ways you can start to explore composition. Okay, how about focal point, Jordan? We're looking at Avengers. What's going on with the focal point?
So focal point is just the area or the space where your eye goes first. Like the main point of the thesis statement of your painting or your drawing is this. And so right here, we're looking at a scene to stand down in Avengers Endgame between Captain America and Thanos. And what I love about this shot is we're seeing two different kind of scenes. We have Captain America on the left, and and behind him is the sun. I can't remember if it's rising or setting at this scene, but we got the sun behind him, and it's showing like he's the heroic figure. And then meanwhile, Thanos on the right, he's surrounded by darkness, and his army is behind him. You see all the little spaceships, and the only reason we could really see him is because they cleverly put a little cloud of dust behind him. But that also shows the destruction that he represents. And so just little simple things like that are really, really key. And this stood out to me in the movie because they hold on this for like 10 seconds. It's very somber. It's very clear that this showdown is about to happen.
Well, in this scene, I think the focal point is pretty clear cut because of the dramatic contrast, bright, shining light. Now, in this one, it's different because you do see the lines that are sort of climaxing at the top of the page, but I knew that this glove was special. I have not seen the movie. I know, Jordan. But I knew looking at this without knowing the story that glove was the focal point. So tell us why it's the focal point in the story.
Sure. So in Infinity War, Thanos is trying to collect these 6 Infinity Stones. Each one does something very powerful. It controls time or reality or space. And he has a special gauntlet that allows him to have all of them at the same time because he wants to control reality. He wants to basically eliminate 50% of all life in the universe. And so the Avengers, our heroes, have to stop him. And the other reason I wanted to pick this image, I wanted to put this in the presentation, is because there's a lot of things here. Typically, we want to focus on a superhero. Well, what do you do when the entire canvas is filled with superheroes? You have Spider-Man, Black Panther, Iron Man, Captain America, Black Widow, Thor. Everyone's here, but you have to make it a single image and make there be a clear focal point and make it be a clear image that has a singular focus.
Space Cadet Katie says, do you think having a, quote, basic or overused composition is something to worry about in an art piece? I don't think so, because it would be like saying, I'm a writer and I don't want to repeat the same story that people have written. It's like it's all been done, right? Same thing with art, same thing with movies. It's just people have different takes on it. That's personal and different. So don't worry about that. Just think about, what am I trying to accomplish and what's the most engaging way for me to do that? Don't worry, because I would find that quite stifling. Okay, how about movement, Jordan? Why is this helpful?
Movement is helpful because it's sort of it's like shape, it's like directional lines, all of those things. It's important because it helps you figure out where you're trying to look in the image. If you want us to look at a single spot and not move throughout the canvas, then that could lead to something that looks very stale, unless you do it for a specific reason. So having things like diagonals that point you to the focal point or radiate, we saw the same type of technique in the Thanos image a second ago, where his glove is radiating all these colors, and it's very similar to this. So yeah.
Tell me in the chat, who can guess what comic this is? It's by Tove Jansson, who's a Norwegian artist, and it's an obscure comic, but the people that know it love it. So let's see who can figure out what that is. But then movement can also be more organic. Like, for example, these Japanese woodblock prints by Hakusai. If you guys look at the big undulating waves, you can see that it keeps your eye moving around the page. So actually, a lot of the things that we're talking about in the stream, they work together. This is not an isolated thing. It works with diagonals and all kinds of other things. And then even sometimes it's not that obvious. Like, this is such a beautiful print, but actually the movement is in the flying pieces of paper that start on the bottom and move all the way up to the right-hand corner. So movement doesn't always have to be so clear cut in terms of the lines. Okay, what do we mean by this, Jordan? A composition that engages with corners and edges.
There's often a phrase that about dead corners or dead spaces in a composition. And I think it's important to make sure every bit of the canvas is utilized. So sometimes that means having light trail off the image, having things cropped, making it feel more realistic, because in any given part of life, you're not going to see everything just pushed together perfectly fitting in its own little bubble. Life happens. Things are sprawled out, things are falling over, things could go off the edge. It's just natural to have things like that.
Like this image here by Jacob Lawrence, how often do you see the entire bus? I mean, most of the time there's something in the way or your view doesn't quite line up. And then things like this, where instead of showing the whole figure, showing a piece of the figure, and also especially giving your audience a reason to travel into those corners. And this is why a lot of times you guys will hear me say, get your subject out of the middle of the page. And by pushing things into the corner that are engaging, or by cropping a figure, you can really start to make some movement going on. Birdsong is asking, what are your favorite books on composition? Do you have any, Jordan? I don't actually have any.
Yeah, there's a book called Framed Ink. I can't remember the author right now, but he is a storyboard artist and a cinematographer. And he has this whole book that talks about why he chose certain shots for these films. And he's like done cowboy movies and action movies and more dramatic stuff. And it's really, really fantastic. And so I really recommend that one off the top of my head. And other than that, I also recommend just studying classical painters. Like, everything's right there.
By the way, the names of all the artists that I showed in the stream, they're all in the video description below. So what I would recommend, just Google a bunch of those artists, pull out some compositions, and just ask yourself, what's going on in here? Do I like it? Do I not like it? And you could just, on an iPad or wherever, draw some of those lines and ask yourself, hey, what's really happening here? So AJ is saying, in terms of corners, I instantly thought of the sun that everyone put in the corner of the page when you're drawing in elementary school. Yeah, it's like, that's the cliche. And I think a lot of you guys saw yesterday when Kat and I did our brainstorming session doing thumbnails for Jack and the Beanstalk, that we both drew the same thing. The first couple drawings we drew were the cliche version. And it wasn't until we sketched for a while that we started to explore other options. So another part of composition, I think, is spending time on it, because composition is not something you figure out in a few minutes. How long does it take you, Jordan, when you're designing a space in a landscape? How long does it take for you to do the composition?
It takes a while. I'll do like 8 to 10 thumbnails, and I'll ask for feedback, and they'll make suggestions on that, and then I'll make those changes. So it takes a while. It's not a quick process, but the more you do it, the easier it does get. And there's certain things you can begin to rely on, the way you think and the way you create, that will help you as you're working on your composition.
By the way, people figured out it was Moomin by Tove Jansson, who actually, if you guys have seen Spirited Away, I swear that little purple mouse at the end that the big baby turns into, I swear that is calling out to Moomin, because it looks so similar. But if you guys want to look at a really weird, it's super cute comic, look up Moomin, because it's really cool. By the way, especially for those of you who are teachers, we are now making our Google slideshows available for you guys to use. If you would like to do that, the link is in the video description below. Art Prof has a podcast. It's available on Spotify and also on iTunes. And in a little bit, we will be hanging out with you guys in the Art Prof Discord in the post live streams channel. So come hang out with us there. We'll chat more about composition, send you guys some thoughts to mull over in terms of helping to improve that skill, because it can be very tricky. Subscribe to the channel if you guys would like to grow more as an artist. And thank you so much to our top Patreon supporters. You guys make it possible for us to make Art Prof 100% free and accessible to everybody. And thank you to everybody in the chat. Great comments, lots of wonderful questions. And we are going to be continuing the series. There's going to be many more streams on composition to help fill in the blanks. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time.